Let's talk about these German farmers' protests, which have been taking place within recent weeks, and they are still going on. So these German farmers got enraged because the government told them that they will no longer receive a fuel subsidy. It requires tons of fuel to power up these giant tractors that these German farmers use. One tractor will hold hundreds of gallons of fuel, and the government told them that it will no longer be subsidizing their fuel costs. And this enraged the farmers, and they started doing these mass demonstrations. And in one instance, they got into a scuffle with the police, at least one that I know of, at least one instance that I know of. And in another instance, they tried to attack the vice chancellor of Germany, Mr. Habeck, and the police had to intervene. So these guys are ferocious. They mean business. They're very serious. And from what I've seen in one demonstration, you can find tens of thousands of German farmers. When you read about these demonstrations, you will see just hordes of farmers in just one setting, in just one protest. And a lot of people in the media have been comparing this to some peasant revolt that took place in the 1500s. They'll say, oh, this is just like the peasant revolt of 15 whatever. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is like what happened in Germany in the 1920s before the rise of Hitler. People are talking about the peasant revolt of Germany. It was the biggest revolt that took place in Europe before the French Revolution. And so this is like the peasants, revolting back in the 16th century. And I'm thinking, wait. You don't have to rewind that far back. You can just go back to the 20th century. You can just go back to the 1920s, not the 1500s, back to the 1920s when you had massive farmers' protests in Germany in the 1920s. And I was reading about this yesterday. I was reading this book last night. It's called The Third Reich by Michael Burleigh. This has been a very informative read. And I've been hearing about these farmers' protests for a little bit now. Within recent weeks, I've been hearing about it, still hearing about it. And I'm reading this book. This book was written back in the early 2000s. It was written back, I want to say, in 2001. And this book is talking about how the Nazis rose up. And it talks about all the different job sectors and how there was tremendous support for the Nazis that grew within various job sectors. And the laborers who were the most militant for the Nazis in the 1920s were the farmers. This is what the book tells us. So I'm reading this history and I'm thinking, it's starting to sound like what's been going on right now with these German farmers protesting against the government. And the book tells us that at the center of this anger against the government was an outrage over subsidies. Because the bigger farmers, the bigger farms in Germany back in the 20s were protected by state subsidies. And the smaller farmers wanted to be protected by subsidies. They wanted government subsidies. And what do these German farmers want? Government subsidies. Now, there's nothing wrong with farmers wanting German subsidies. That's not the issue that I am bringing up here. And so please spare me with all the nonsense. Oh, some farmers want subsidies that are Nazis? No one's saying that. No one's making that argument. We're simply making parallels between what's happening now and what happened back in the 1920s. Because this is a warning. That's what this video is. It's a warning. I'm not here to tell you all the details about these protests. Leave that to the newspapers. I'm talking about parallels between history and now. The farmers who were protesting back in the 1920s were huge supporters for the Nazis. And they had massive protests. The biggest protest that the farmers had back in the 1920s had over 100,000 farmers. And you could find, like today, demonstrations in the 1920s where you would have tens of thousands of farmers assembled together to protest against the state. The farmers were some of the biggest supporters in Germany for the National Socialists, for the Nazis. And you look at the farmers in Germany today, and you look at the farmers who are protesting, a lot of these farmers support the AfD. A lot of these farmers support the AfD. And I read on the news yesterday that some of these farmers would say, no, I don't support the AfD. Well, some of them probably don't support the AfD. But I suspect that a lot of them are lying. People lie about their political affiliations all the time. Just ask an American, specifically a white American, an Anglo-American, who they voted for. It's very rare for them to tell you who they want to vote for, let alone who they voted for in the past. They keep that stuff very private because they're afraid that somebody's going to key their car or something. And nationalists in Germany, nationalists in Austria will lie about what they really believe in. They will hide behind slogans. They'll hide behind certain popular hot-button issues. And they will hide behind these issues their real motivations. They will use hot-button issues. They will use headline points of contention as curtains to hide their real motivations. How do I know this? Well, I dealt with a major nationalist leader in the meta-political world in Austria. I was not in Austria, but I confronted him in an online interview that I did back in 2017. His name is Martin Sellner. And Martin Sellner is one of the leaders of the Austrian identitarian movement, and he is known pretty well in the European identitarian movement, not just in Austria, but in Europe as a whole, in the whole European movement as a whole. And I brought up and I know I sound like some liberal when I talk like this, but I brought up the anti-Semitism that is rife within the European New Right / identitarian movement. And I asked him what he thought about this. And he told me that he did not support it. He said, I don't support that way of thinking. I don't support that type of rhetoric. And at that time, Martin Sellner did not talk about the Jews. At that time, he just made it an issue about immigration, mass migration, and migrants. Because that is still a hot button issue in Europe that the European right is totally centered on. They are totally centered on their disagreement with immigration policy in Europe. And so they hide behind that point of contention their real motivations. And this is what all these people do. They have to, because they want to have a certain image. They want to have the image as the simple salt-of-the-earth patriots who are simply fighting against mass migration. They're not Nazis. They aren't far-right. They're not Hitlerians in any way. They don't want to go back to the Third Reich or anything like that. They just want to stop mass migration. That's it. They use that image to hide their true motivations and their true ideologies. And Martin Sellner hid that when I confronted him on it. He hid his true motivation. And he has kept that image for a number of years. He kept that image really, I would say, for the most part, until Israel bombed Gaza late last year. And late last year, when Israel started its bombing campaign in Gaza, the magazine that Sellner writes for, it's called Secession. It's ran by one of the big right-wing ideologues in Europe. His name is Götz Kubitschek. He is a German Nazi who, he's a nationalist, and he hides behind nationalism, the title of nationalism, but he's really just a Nazi. And all of a sudden, once Israel started bombing Gaza, Secession, Martin Sellner, the magazine that Sellner writes for, started writing all of these articles, started publishing all of these articles against the Jews. And they started to show their true colors. Why? Well, because the whole world is angry with Israel. Might as well just expose our own Jew hatred. And Sellner started writing about the Jews, and his colleagues started writing about the Jews, and Götz Kubitschek started talking about the Jews, and Jew hatred is becoming more and more mainstream. We're seeing it. We are seeing the mainstreaming, if I can use that word. I just made it up. We are seeing the mainstreaming of Jew hatred. That's what we are seeing. It's not just in the Islamic world. Let's not forget that the biggest massacre of the Jews did not take place in the Middle East. The biggest massacre of the Jews took place in Europe. The biggest series of massacres took place in Europe. They took place in Ukraine. They took place in Croatia. They took place in Romania. They took place in Germany. They took place in Poland, done by the Nazis. So Europe has a history of this, and that's putting it very lightly. And so they started to show their true colors. Well, why didn't Zellner express these opinions to me when I confronted him back in 2017? And let's remember, Zellner is an AfD supporter. Even though he is Austrian, he fully supports the AfD. He loves the AfD. All these identitarians are AfD supporters. And the AfD has ties with Gotz Kubitschek and his movement. And a lot of these farmers are AfD supporters. They are part of the nationalist realm of the German metapolitical center, the German metapolitical faction. And you can see the parallel between now and the 1920s. In the 1920s, the farmers were the most militant followers of the Nazis out of any other job sector. They were the most militant laborers for the Nazis. And they conducted massive protests against the state in the 1920s, and they wanted government subsidies. The farmers today in Germany, a lot of them are right-wing nationalists who support the AfD, and they're protesting over subsidies. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it sure as hell rhymes. And people have a lot of difficulty. I've noticed this for years. People have a lot of difficulty simply acknowledging that Nazis exist. And I'm not talking about liberals. Liberals will say, oh, yes, this guy's far right and he's a Nazi and blah, blah, blah. But conservatives and people who are center-right, be it in America, be it in Europe, it doesn't matter. They have a lot of difficulty acknowledging that Nazis exist. They will say communists, they will say far left, but when you bring up, and they will say liberals are the Nazis, right? They'll say, oh, the liberals, those are the real Nazis. But when it comes to actually pointing out real far-right nationalists, pointing them out as Nazis, center-right people and conservatives have a lot of difficulty simply pointing this out. They have a lot of difficulty simply acknowledging that these people exist, but they do exist. They are Nazis out there. Yes, they are a lot of them out there. And these people who claim to be just simple patriots, a lot of them are Nazis. A lot of them. In Germany, you see them. Oh, we're just patriots, and they support the AfD. They love Björn Höcke. How could you be just a regular center-right guy and support someone like Björn Höcke? Björn Höcke is someone who has expressed his antagonism towards Holocaust memorials. He is someone who has expressed belief in social Darwinism. How can you follow the AfD party who had a member who was begging for Hitler to return? How can you follow such a party and just be a regular center-right person? A lot of these people are just Nazis. A lot of these people are just goose-stepping, Hitler-loving, swastika-wearing Nazis. And they don't have the swastikas in public. They have them behind closed doors. People have difficulty just recognizing, just acknowledging that Nazis exist. These people exist. They are monsters behind the closet. These are the monsters. And truth is much stranger than fiction. People want to talk about 1984. Oh, I read the George Orwell book. Let's look at history. Why are we reading 1984? Why are we reading some fictional book, some novel? Let's read history. Let's just read history. The books on history give you the guideline. They tell you, it's like the manual for the future. How can we guess the future? How can we anticipate the future? Oh, we just read history. And we're not going to get every single detail for the future, right? The future is not going to happen exactly the way the past took place, exactly the way history took place. But history gives you the rough draft for the future. It gives you an idea as to what's going to happen. And when you read that in the 1920s, the most militant laborers for the Nazis were the farmers, and they had massive protest in Germany. And they were angry about bigger farmers receiving subsidies while they didn't get subsidies. And you look at what's happening today in Germany, and you see massive protests done by farmers, and they're angry about subsidies. And they're AfD supporters, and they're nationalists. It's not far-fetched, and nor is it left-wing or liberal, to make a parallel between what happened in history and what's happening now. And if you want to make a big deal about that, if you want to be angry about someone making such a parallel, then maybe you're the snowflake that you claim everyone else is. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.